We just got to keep going and, we want to stay in the top six. We've been up there. It'd be horrible to drift away from that now. And the boys, we keep our tails up if we're in the top six. So, main thing is we're enjoying it, aren't we? We're enjoying it.
I ran on and it was like a minute.
No, you've done it in 5 seconds. That's quicker than a minute.
Well, no, about a second, I'll say. Yeah. Worked it out that as the ref looked at both goalkeepers, as he put the whistle to his mouth, I set off. So as he actually blew, I was...
He'd walk all over you. That is how Sir Alex Ferguson described the experience of facing Vinnie Jones. Not just the tackles, not just the fouls, the man himself. The whole experience of being on the same pitch as him. Sir Alex said it like he was warning somebody, like he was passing on information that had been learned the hard way. And he was right to warn them, because when Vinnie Jones decided that you were his problem for the afternoon, everything changed. The game changed. The pitch changed. Your own body changed. Your legs got heavy before you got a touch of the ball. Your head started filling with thoughts that had nothing to do with tactics or positioning. And the terrifying thing was that none of it happened by accident. That is the story we are telling today. And we are telling it through the voices of the men who lived it. 6 football legends. 6 men who stood in the same tunnel, on the same pitch, in the same dressing room, and felt exactly what Vinnie Jones could do to a person. Some of them were rattled. Some of them were physically shaken. And one of them was already asking the referee how long was left after just a few minutes of play. A genius. A once-in-a-generation footballer. Counting down the seconds to get away from Vinnie Jones. We are counting down from number 6 all the way to number 1. And the closer we get to number 1, the more you are going to understand why this man became the most feared figure in British football. Before we start though, if this video is getting your blood pumping already, hit the hype on it. Give this video your hype right now. It matters more than you know, and it keeps these kinds of stories alive. Right, let us begin. But before we get to the legends themselves, we need to go back to the beginning. Because Vinnie Jones did not arrive in professional football carrying a silver spoon. He did not come through a polished academy system with warm pitches and nutritionists and coaches who mapped out his every development. He came from somewhere harder than that. His parents split up when he was young. There was turbulence, real turbulence, the kind that knocks a young man sideways before he has even figured out who he is. He ended up away from the game entirely for a period, working as a building site labourer, getting up early, working with his hands, physical, grinding, dirty work. Football was not a given for him. It was not guaranteed. It was a second chance, a lifeline that he grabbed with everything he had. That second chance came through non-league Wealdstone, not a glamorous stage, not a place the cameras visited, but it was football, and it was where Jones built the toolkit that would eventually terrify the best players in England. He learned the robust tricks of the trade, how to use every inch of his body, how to impose his will before someone else imposed theirs on him. By the time Wimbledon came calling in 1986, he was already formed, already sharp, already dangerous. Now Wimbledon. You have to stop and really think about what Wimbledon were, because what they achieved in the decade before the 1988 FA Cup final was genuinely extraordinary. 4 years. That is how long it took for them to go from the 4th tier of English football to the 1st division. 4 years. That kind of rise does not happen. It did not happen before, and it has barely happened since. And it was not achieved through big spending or celebrity managers or famous name signings. It was achieved through something far more powerful and far harder to measure. Identity. Collective belief. A siege mentality so fierce and so consistent that it became a weapon in its own right. Dave Bassett built the foundations. Wally Downs helped shape the culture, and gradually the crazy gang took form. Dennis Wise arrived with his sharp edges and his provocateur instincts. John Fashanu brought physical presence and genuine menace. And when Vinnie Jones walked through the door, the group became complete. Because what Jones brought was not just physical force. He brought the ability to make the entire experience of playing against Wimbledon feel like a hostile encounter from the moment you arrived. Opposition teams began arriving already unsettled, already second-guessing themselves, already psychologically beaten before they had warmed up. This was not random. It was not just the natural consequence of having tough players. It was deliberate preconditioning. The reputation of Wimbledon, and specifically the reputation of Jones, was managed and maintained as a tactical tool. The other team knew what was coming, and knowing made it worse. You can prepare for a tactical formation. You can watch footage of a player's preferred runs, but you cannot prepare for the feeling of dread that builds in the days before you face a man like Vinnie Jones. Jones described the Wimbledon environment simply. You grew a backbone or you dissolved as a man. There was no comfortable middle ground. That was the culture, that was the choice, and every player who joined the club had to make it. What is easy to miss from the outside is how much discipline it required to run that environment consistently. Aggression without structure falls apart. It burns out. It creates enemies in the dressing room before it creates them on the pitch. But Wimbledon's aggression had direction. It was pointed outward, at opponents, at critics, at every pundit who dismissed them as anti-football. The crazy gang were not simply wild, they were organised, and Jones was one of the men who kept that structure intact, week after week, season after season. That discipline is what separates a hard team from a great team. Wimbledon, in that era, were a great team. Now, the countdown. Number 6. Graham Souness. Graham Souness never wore a Wimbledon shirt. He was not part of the crazy gang. He was a Liverpool man, a Rangers man, one of the most decorated players of his generation. But he made Vinnie Jones's personal list of the hardest 11 footballers he had ever seen. Jones described Souness as an incredibly aggressive player, the kind of man who set the tone from the first minute, the kind of presence that opponents could feel from across the pitch. Souness had been the engine of the Liverpool dynasty that dominated English football throughout the late 70s and early 80s. He combined elite technical quality with a physical menace that even his own teammates were sometimes wary of. He was, in many ways, the prototype for the role that Jones would later make entirely his own. What Jones's admiration for Souness tells us is important. Jones did not see himself as a one-off. He saw himself as part of a tradition, a lineage of players who understood that football was also a mental game, a game of presence and will. Souness was the generation before him, the man who laid the groundwork for the enforcer role, and Jones looked at that with genuine respect. He saw in Souness a mirror. Duncan Ferguson also made the 11. Jones called him a genuine hard man, raw emotion, authentic toughness, not performed, not manufactured, real. That is precisely what Jones valued. Not the appearance of toughness, the real thing, the core of yourself that cannot be broken. Souness had it, Ferguson had it, and Vinnie Jones had it, in a way few men in the history of the game have matched. Number 5. Robbie Earle. If Graham Souness gives us the external perspective, the view from another club, another generation, then Robbie Earle gives us something even more valuable. He gives us the inside view. He was there, every day, in the Wimbledon dressing room, on the Wimbledon training ground, standing in the tunnel next to Jones before games, and what he describes changes the way you understand what Jones was doing, because from the inside, it looks completely different to the way it looks from the outside. From the outside, it looked like aggression, like chaos, like a rough team with rough players doing rough things. But from the inside, what Earle saw was leadership, organised, purposeful, extraordinary leadership. Jones viewed himself as the midfield enforcer, the captain in spirit, if not always in name, the man whose job it was to make sure the psychological battle was won before the physical one began. He described it as winning the game before a ball was kicked, and Earle confirmed that this was not just a phrase, it was a genuine operational strategy. Jones arrived at every match with the explicit intention of making the opposition feel, before the whistle, that today was going to be a dark and painful afternoon. Leadership at Wimbledon in that era was not about quiet encouragement. It was not about calm tactical discussions and gentle motivation. It was about roaring, about turning up the heat in the dressing room until it was almost unbearable, about creating an atmosphere so intense, so focused, so collectively charged that by the time the players stepped out onto the pitch, they were already somewhere else, already in a place where ordinary limitations did not apply, and Jones was the source of that heat. He was the man who kept it burning. For a club like Wimbledon, this was not a choice. It was the only option. They could not match Liverpool's budget. They could not match Manchester United's squad depth. They could not compete in the market for international talent. So they had to compete in the market for desire and psychological dominance. And Jones was the man who made sure they won that market every single time. By creating an atmosphere of total commitment and total fearlessness around the team, he freed players like Earle to do their jobs without distraction. The perimeter was secured. The psychological battlefield was already won. Earle could focus on the technical side, knowing that the other side was already rattled. That was the extraordinary thing about Jones's leadership. It was not just about what he did to opponents, it was about what it gave his own players. Space, freedom, permission to play. Number 4. David Ginola. David Ginola was a different kind of problem for Vinnie Jones. Not because Ginola was harder to intimidate than other players, but because the clash between them represented something bigger than a single match. It represented the collision of two completely different ideas about what football was supposed to be. Ginola came from French football, from a culture that celebrated the beautiful, that rewarded flair and imagination and elegance. He arrived in England looking like he had stepped out of a film. Long hair, flowing movement, the kind of player who made people gasp, the kind of player who reminded you that football could be a form of art. He had never encountered anything quite like Vinnie Jones before. The English game was more physical than what he was used to, certainly, but Jones was something else entirely. Jones was not just physical, he was purposefully threatening, deliberately uncomfortable to be around. He had a belligerent pride about him that was completely foreign to Ginola's experience of the game. For Jones, stopping Ginola was not a complicated assignment, but it was a meaningful one, because Ginola represented the direction the game was heading, a game that was increasingly in love with technical finesse, with aesthetics, with players who looked good on the highlights reel, and Jones stood against all of that, not out of ignorance, not out of bitterness, but out of genuine competitive conviction. He believed, deeply and without apology, that strong, athletic, physical players still had a place in the game, that they always would have a place, and every time he stepped onto a pitch against a player like Ginola, he was making that argument through his body, through his presence, through the culture shock he delivered to every technically gifted footballer who crossed his path. The clash between them was a microcosm of everything that was happening in English football during that period. The old game pushing back against the new game, brute force and will refusing to be replaced by elegance and craft. And while history has largely judged the aesthetics to have won, Vinnie Jones's record, the clubs he helped, the trophies his side won, the players he neutralized, suggests that his version of the argument had far more substance than his critics were ever willing to admit. Number 3. Ian Wright. Ian Wright was fire and electricity on a football pitch, explosive from the first second, sharp, instinctive, the kind of striker who could change a game before you had even blinked. He had his own fierce temperament. He was not someone you could easily intimidate. He had spent years competing at the highest level, and he had earned every inch of the respect he received. But when Ian Wright talked about facing Vinnie Jones, the language he used was different from anything he used to describe any other opponent. He did not talk about tactical problems. He did not talk about physical challenges. He talked about a hunt. That word is everything. A hunt is not a game. A hunt has a predator and it has prey. A hunt is personal and it is relentless, and it does not end just because you had a good first touch or a good first 10 minutes. Jones was hunting Wright from before the whistle, finding him in the warm-up, identifying him, marking him as the target, creating in Wright's mind the awareness that for the next 90 minutes, every single time he got the ball, there was a man coming for him with deliberate, focused, physical intent. What this did to Wright was exactly what Jones intended it to do. It took energy, mental energy. The energy that should have been going into movement and positioning and reading the game was instead going into scanning, into awareness of where Jones was, into the constant background noise of knowing he was close. And a striker who is not fully free in his own head is a striker who is operating at less than his best. Jones did not need to kick Wright repeatedly to achieve his goal. He just needed to make Wright spend the entire match in a state of low-level anxiety. The physical consequences were always implied rather than constantly delivered, and the implied threat is often more powerful than the actual one. This is where the relationship with Dennis Wise adds another layer. Wise was the perfect partner for Jones because they operated on completely different frequencies. Wise irritated. He nipped and snapped and provoked. He was brilliant at getting under the skin of opponents. Clever little fouls, sharp words, drawing reactions, making the game feel petty and irritating. On his own, Wise was an annoyance. You could manage an annoyance. You could breathe through the irritation and stay focused, but Wise was never on his own. Behind him, always, was Jones. And knowing that Jones was the consequence of reacting to Wise made everything Wise did 10 times worse. The two of them created a prison for the opposition. You could not ignore Wise because he would not let you. You could not react to Wise because Jones would punish you for it. There was no door out. Number 2. Sir Alex Ferguson. Sir Alex Ferguson is one of the greatest managers in the history of the game. He built dynasties. He identified talent. He created cultures of excellence at every club he touched. He had standards that were uncompromising, and he held everyone around him to those standards without exception. When he faced Wimbledon, when he faced the Crazy Gang, when he faced Vinnie Jones, he called the experience a war of attrition. 3 words, and every one of them matters. A war, not a match, not a tactical problem. A war, something that grinds you down. Something where the point is not to win a single exchange, but to exhaust the enemy. Attrition, the wearing away of something strong through constant pressure and friction. That is what Wimbledon did to Ferguson's Manchester United. They did not try to outskill them. They did not try to outpossess them, or outpass them, or outmaneuver them in the technical sense. They simply refused to let United play. They made the pitch feel like a battlefield. They made every touch feel like a risk, and they did it relentlessly, from the first minute to the last. Ferguson's frustration came from a place of genuine philosophy. He believed in a particular kind of football. He had a vision for what the game should look like, and he worked every day to bring that vision to life. And Wimbledon challenged that vision, not by being better, but by being different. By refusing to engage on the terms that Ferguson understood, they brought a style of play that was a legitimate response to the enormous disparity in resources between the two clubs. Wimbledon could not beat United with money, they could not beat them with technical polish, so they beat them with psychological warfare, with physical intensity, and with a collective refusal to accept that the result was already determined. While Ferguson represented the establishment, there was also Gary Lineker, television-friendly, media-polished, the acceptable face of English football. Lineker made his feelings about Wimbledon and about Jones very clear. He said the best way to watch Wimbledon was on CFAX or teletext. Text on a screen, no moving images required. He dismissed their style as anti-football. He called Jones no benefit to the game. These were not mild criticisms, they were dismissals, attempts to delegitimize an entire way of playing and an entire way of competing. But something interesting happened when that criticism arrived at Wimbledon's door. Instead of causing doubt, instead of creating division or demoralization, it did the opposite. It became fuel. The entire Wimbledon squad signed a letter, the Jellyfish Man letter, they called it, featuring drawings of jellyfish beside Lineker's name. The message was clear and it was cutting. You have no sting, you have no spine, you are spineless like a jellyfish. The letter was brilliant, not just because it was funny, but because it showed that Wimbledon had taken what was meant to hurt them and turned it into something that made them stronger. Lineker thought he was exposing them. He was actually arming them. That defiant response, that fierce collective pride, was exactly the kind of us against the world energy that Wimbledon ran on, and Jones was right at the center of it. Number 1. Paul Gascoigne. This is the one that matters most. This is the one that defines everything, because Paul Gascoigne was not simply a good footballer, he was a phenomenon, one of the most naturally gifted players this country has ever produced. Creative beyond measure, joyful, unpredictable in the way that only true genius is unpredictable, because you cannot prepare for something you have never seen before. He played with a freedom and a childlike delight that made watching him feel like a gift. When Gaza was on form and free and happy, he could do things that made the entire stadium fall silent before erupting. He was not just a footballer, he was an experience. And Vinnie Jones chose him, specifically, deliberately. Not because Gascoigne was weak, the opposite, because he was the most dangerous, most influential player on the pitch, because shutting him down would be the most significant thing Jones could possibly do for his team that day. Jones did not target the vulnerable, he targeted the exceptional. And in February 1988, in a match between Newcastle and Wimbledon, he executed one of the most precise and calculated acts of psychological warfare in football history. It began in the tunnel, not in the stadium, not when the referee had the ball, in the tunnel. That narrow corridor where two teams stand meters apart, waiting to walk out into the noise. Jones walked straight up to Gascoigne and delivered these words directly and without blinking. "It's just you and me today, fatty. I ain't playing football, and neither are you." Read that again. Every single part of that sentence is engineered. He is not talking about the game. He is removing the game from the equation entirely. He is telling Gascoigne that whatever was going to happen out there that afternoon had nothing to do with football. It was personal. It was physical. It was between two men, and only one of them had decided to show up for a war. Gascoigne thrived on joy, on creative freedom, on the ability to express himself without restriction or fear. That is where his genius lived, in that free space. And what Jones did in the tunnel was close that space before the match had even started. He planted a thought in Gascoigne's head that did not leave for the entire 90 minutes. A thought about what was coming, about where Jones was, about when it was going to happen. He transformed Gascoigne's inner world from creative joy into constant alert. The tactical execution was relentless and beautifully specific. At corners, Jones would move away to deliver the ball, and as he left, he would tell Gascoigne he was going to take a corner, but he would be back for him in a minute. Think about what that does. Even in the moments when Jones was physically on the other side of the pitch, he was still occupying space in Gascoigne's head. The promise of return, the certainty of continuation. There was no moment in that match when Gascoigne was free of Jones, even when Jones was standing 20 yards away, because Jones had made sure that the threat was constant and total and everywhere. Then came the grab. There was a moment where Gascoigne, being Gascoigne, tried to give a little back. He said something to Jones about earning his £100 that day, a cheeky remark, trying to reduce Jones to a hired instrument, trying to take back some ground. And Jones's response was physical and immediate and total. He escalated in a way that removed any possibility of Gascoigne having the last word. He asserted dominance over the space in the most direct way available to him. Gascoigne later remembered the veins standing out on Jones's neck, the intensity in his face, the absolute, total focus. And Gascoigne, Paul Gascoigne, one of the most talented footballers alive at that moment, was asking the referee how long was left only minutes into the match. Not half time, not with 10 minutes to go, minutes in. He wanted to be somewhere else, anywhere else. He wanted it to be over. That image, a genius counting down the seconds, is perhaps the single clearest measure of what Jones was capable of. Not a stat in a record book, not a yellow card on a referee's notepad. A world-class footballer reduced to clock watching. That is what Vinnie Jones achieved with nothing more than presence, words, and the absolute certainty of his own purpose. Most players can only hope to physically stop a great player. Jones stopped Gascoigne mentally, and once a player like Gascoigne is stopped mentally, the physical is almost irrelevant. But here is where the story becomes something more than just a story about intimidation. After the final whistle, the two men exchanged gifts. Gascoigne sent Jones a rose. Jones sent Gascoigne a toilet brush. The rose was Gaza to the core, cheeky and irreverent and impossible to fully contain. The toilet brush was Jones to the core, rough and uncompromising and with an unmistakable message underneath it all. But the fact that they exchanged anything is the point. There was a code between these two men, an acknowledgement, a mutual respect that existed beneath everything that had happened. Gascoigne knew that what Jones had done was professional, was deliberate, was real football, even if it did not look like what most people thought football was supposed to look like. And what Jones achieved that day stands as a genuine and lasting footballing accomplishment. He marked Paul Gascoigne out of a match, not through technical superiority, not through greater tactical intelligence, but through psychological dominance, physical will, and the absolute refusal to let one of the greatest players in the world be comfortable for a single second. That is as real and as valid as a perfectly weighted through ball or a curling finish from 30 yards. Jones neutralized genius. That counts. That is something. Now, the final piece of the picture. The thing that proves the whole philosophy worked at the highest possible level. The 14th of May, 1988. Wembley Stadium. Wimbledon versus Liverpool. The FA Cup final. Liverpool were the First Division champions. A squad filled with international players. Technically brilliant. Experienced at the biggest occasions. Everything about them said this was a formality. The bookmakers said it was a formality. Most people watching said it was a formality. Wimbledon were not supposed to be there in any meaningful sense. They were supposed to lose with dignity and go home. The night before the final, manager Bobby Gould made a decision that no other manager would have made on the eve of the biggest match of their careers. He gave each player £100 and told them to go to the pub. Not a tactical meeting, not an extra training session, not a film of Liverpool's weaknesses. The pub. It was a masterstroke in psychological management. It said to every Wimbledon player, in the clearest possible possible terms that they did not need to change who they were to win this match. They were the crazy gang. That was their identity. That was their power. And tomorrow, they were going to walk out at Wembley being exactly who they had always been. On the morning of the final, Jones described his teammates as raring to go. Liverpool, by contrast, were reportedly flat, some internal friction in their camp, not fully switched on, not quite there. And when the match began, Wimbledon played it entirely on their own terms. Physical, direct, relentless, feather-ruffling, refusing to be impressed or intimidated or overawed by the scale of the occasion or the quality of the opposition. They had spent years preparing for exactly this. Not this specific match necessarily, but this specific feeling. The feeling of being the underdog, of being dismissed, of being told they did not belong. They had been training for this their whole careers. The final whistle confirmed what the crazy gang had been saying all along. 1-0 Wimbledon. An FA Cup victory that shocked the football world and has never been fully forgotten. A previously implausible conquest. They wanted it more. Simple as that. On the biggest stage in English domestic football, against the best team in the country, Wimbledon wanted it more. And Jones was the beating heart of that desire. The man who had been making opponents feel that desire as a physical force for years. From Wembley 1988, the story takes an extraordinary turn because Vinnie Jones was not finished reinventing himself. In 1998, while he was still a professional footballer, he appeared in Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. He played Big Chris, a debt collector, a man of quiet, enormous, inevitable threat. It was not acting in the way that most people understand acting. It was a continuation of what he had always done. He had been performing the hard man for 15 years. The camera simply found a new way to capture it. He was awarded the Empire Award for Best Newcomer for that role. A footballer, still playing, collecting acting awards. Then came Snatch in 2000, where he played Bullet-Tooth Tony and won the Empire Award for Best British Actor. In 2006, he became the Juggernaut in X-Men The Last Stand, and from that role came something Jones could never have predicted: a meme. A line from the film became one of the most widely shared, most widely quoted pieces of internet culture of its time. A former building site labourer from non-league football had become a Hollywood meme. By 2020, he had expanded again, producing and leading The Big Ugly, a film that showed a range that went beyond the hard man archetype he had built his career on. He worked alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger, he worked alongside Jason Statham, he appeared in over 100 films and television shows, and he asked a question that deserves to be heard slowly. Did you ever think I would score the winner against Man United? Did you think I would win the FA Cup? Did you think I would win Best British Actor? Nobody thought any of those things. Not when he was on a building site, not when he was at Wealdstone, not even when he was at Wimbledon. But he did all of them, because the qualities that made him terrifying on a football pitch, the focus, the refusal to accept limitations, the ability to perform under pressure, the sheer force of will, all of those qualities transferred perfectly to a new stage. In his later years, Jones has been honest about the journey. Through therapy and self-reflection, he looked back at the moments when the rails wobbled, when the wheels were going, as he described it. But he would not take any of it back. Not the youth, not the building site, not the crazy gang, not the criticism. All of it was part of the same story. A man who used every tool available to build a life nobody saw coming. He was called no benefit to the game. He was accused of bringing the game into disrepute. He was dismissed as anti-football by people who stood in front of television cameras and told the world that what he did was not valid. But he looked back at all of that with something close to dignity. He called his style ultimately harmless. He pointed to the career he built and the team he was part of and the achievements that nobody can take away. And he let the evidence speak for itself. Because the evidence is remarkable. A club from the 4th tier rose to the summit in 4 years. They won the FA Cup against the champions of the league. They did it by refusing to be something they were not, by building an identity so fierce that Gary Lineker's mockery only made it stronger. At the center of all of that was a man who understood something fundamental. The game is not played only with your feet. It is played with your presence, your will, the weight of your reputation before you have touched the ball. Vinnie Jones was never just a bully. That label was always too convenient and too small. He was a tactician of psychological warfare, a leader who understood that winning the battle in someone's head was the first and and most important victory. A man who took every disadvantage he had, the lack of resources, the lack of refinement, the lack of polish, and turned it into an identity that opponents feared and teammates drew strength from. Number 6 put him in a lineage of enforcers and recognized something noble in the tradition. Number 5 lived alongside it every day and called it extraordinary leadership. Number 4 experienced the culture shock of meeting his belligerent pride head-on. Number 3 ran onto the pitch, knowing he was being hunted and had to find a way to play anyway. Number 2 called it a war of attrition and spent years trying to prepare his world-class players for something that could not be fully prepared for. And number 1, the greatest natural talent of his generation, was asking the referee for the time after a few minutes had gone, counting down the seconds, wanting it to be over. That is Vinnie Jones. Not a villain, not a fraud, not someone who stumbled into success by accident. A man who started with almost nothing, who used every single thing available to him, who climbed from a building site to Wembley to Hollywood, and who proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the fear he generated was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to be proud of. It was something to be built on. It was something that lasted long after the final whistle, long after the last tackle, long after the crowds had gone home. He would walk all over you. The legends have confirmed it, every single one, and perhaps that is the most honest final word. Football remembers its artists most easily, the silky touches, the curling free kicks, the highlights that replay forever. It takes longer to acknowledge the men who made all of that possible, the ones who cleared the space, who set the tone, who stood in the tunnel and decided before a ball had moved that today was theirs. Vinnie Jones was that man. The one who understood that desire, properly channeled, is as powerful as any talent on earth. The legends confirmed it, Wembley proved it, and Paul Gascoigne, counting down the seconds to escape him, proves it forever.